Imagine a remote village in 1849 Kentucky, shrouded in mist and whispers of the unnatural. The locals spoke in hushed tones about a girl who seemed to have an unholy connection with the crows that circled above. One day, the village vanished, leaving behind only twisted remnants of beaks and bones, a scene so horrifying it was whispered about for generations. What dark secrets did she hold, and how could a single girl command the forces of death itself? In the heart of 1849 Kentucky, tucked away among mist-covered hills and dense forests, a girl was born who would become the center of whispered fears and restless nightmares for generations to come. Her parents were simple folk, farmers who eked out a living from the unforgiving soil, but even among the ordinary rhythms of village life, she was different. From the moment she could walk, there was a strange intensity in her eyes, dark and unblinking, as if she saw things that belonged to another world entirely. The villagers noticed it first in small, almost imperceptible ways, the way she seemed to anticipate storms before the clouds gathered, or how birds of every kind appeared to recognize her presence. Crows, in particular, were drawn to her as though some invisible thread connected their fates. They would follow her through the narrow dirt streets, perching silently on rooftops and fence posts, their black eyes reflecting a curiosity tinged with something older, something knowing. Her affinity with the crows became more pronounced as she grew older. By the time she was 7, it was a common sight to see dozens of the birds swarming around her, waiting expectantly when she brought scraps of food from her home. The villagers called her peculiar, some whispering that she had a gift, while others muttered darker suspicions, claiming she was cursed or touched by the devil. She never spoke much, and when she did, it was often in a voice too calm, too deliberate for a child her age. Her words carried weight, even when they were mundane, and people found themselves unnerved by the certainty with which she stated even the smallest observations. They said she could see into the hearts of men, and perhaps even the souls of the dead, though no one dared confront her directly about such things. Her interactions with the crows were unsettling to the villagers. She would sit for hours in the clearing behind her home, scattering corn and pieces of meat, murmuring under her breath in a tongue no one recognized. The birds obeyed her commands without hesitation, forming patterns in the sky, descending in perfect synchrony, and often bringing gifts from the forest, shiny stones, bones of small animals, or strange feathers that did not belong to any species known in the region. Some villagers reported hearing the flapping of wings in the dead of night, shadows moving across their windows, and an uncanny sense that the girl was not alone, even when she was not visible. Her parents tried to shield her from these murmurs, but fear spread quickly in a place where superstition was as deeply rooted as the oak trees that lined the hills. By the time she reached her early teens, her reputation had grown to the point where children would cross the road to avoid her, and even the most skeptical adults gave her a wide berth. She walked with an unnatural grace, her movements fluid, almost predatory, and her eyes seemed to glimmer in the dim light of dawn or dusk. Some nights, the villagers would glimpse her standing atop a hill, arms outstretched, surrounded by a murmuration of crows that darkened the sky, and hear her low, melodic voice carrying across the valley in words none could understand. No one dared approach, yet the crows remained, circling and calling to her, as if her presence was a signal that commanded the wild creatures themselves. The girl's connection to death and decay became more apparent over time. She would disappear into the forest for hours, sometimes days, returning with soil-stained hands and clothes torn from brambles, yet carrying gifts that seemed eerily significant. Skulls of rodents, birds she had found already dead, bones of animals unknown to the villagers, and at times what some claimed were tiny human bones. Whether she had discovered them in secret burial sites or they had fallen from the sky, no one knew, but the unease was palpable. The local preacher warned her parents of sin and dark pacts, insisting they keep her close and pray for her soul. Yet no punishment, no admonishment, and no fear seemed to deter her from her rituals. The girl seemed to exist in a world that overlapped with theirs, but was governed by different rules, a world where the birds were her companions, her eyes mirrored the shadows of the trees, and her voice carried through the wind as both a warning and a lullaby. Even in mundane village settings, her influence was unnerving. Farm animals would refuse to enter the barn if she was near. Dogs would growl and cower despite being familiar with her, and neighbors swore that even the fireflies avoided her presence at night. Some claimed that sickness and death seemed drawn to the village when she wandered its streets alone, though others attributed it to coincidence. Every time someone fell ill or a child went missing, whispers would point toward her, even if the evidence was circumstantial. The crows, they said, seemed to feast on the misfortune, gathering en masse and observing the villagers with an intelligence that chilled the spine. As the girl matured, her reputation transcended mere superstition. It became legend. People began to speak of her in hushed tones at the tavern, around the hearth, and on the edges of the marketplace. Travelers who passed through the village would note the strange black clouds of birds, the silence that descended when she appeared, and the lingering sense of dread that seemed to follow her like a shadow. And through it all, she remained unchanged, unafraid, almost serene, her gaze unwavering, feeding the crows, communing with the unseen, and preparing for a fate that the villagers could not yet comprehend. Life in the village began to change in subtle, almost imperceptible ways after the girl's connection with the crows became widely known. At first, it was small things: livestock disappearing, chickens found with their feathers plucked in impossible patterns, and goats trembling as though possessed by unseen forces. Villagers whispered among themselves that it was the girl's doing, though none could prove it, and even those who had once been her allies or neighbors started to look at her with suspicion. Doors were bolted at night, fires kept burning long after the hearth should have gone cold, and people avoided the areas where the crows gathered most densely. Yet the girl seemed unaffected by the tension, moving through the village as though invisible, her eyes always on the horizon where the black-winged sentinels circled. Soon more sinister patterns emerged. Children began to report hearing strange sounds in the woods, the cawing of crows joined by voices that mimicked human speech, cries for help that vanished when adults came searching. Livestock showed injuries far worse than simple predation, cuts precise and deliberate, as if made with sharp tools rather than teeth or claws, and some animals vanished entirely, leaving only blood-stained ground and feathers in their place. The villagers tried to maintain the semblance of normal life, tending to fields and trading with neighboring settlements, but the sense of unease became a permanent companion. People would glance nervously at the sky, noting the ever-present flocks of crows, which had grown in size and ferocity. They seemed to anticipate events before they happened, congregating ominously at the edge of the forest whenever a villager fell ill or misfortune struck. Rumors spread quickly about the girl's role in these events. Some claimed she spoke to the birds in a language older than English, a tongue that carried curses and promises in equal measure. Others swore that she could see the weaknesses of men and women, the dark desires that lurked behind polite smiles, and that she whispered these truths to the crows, which then acted as agents of her silent vengeance. Those who dismissed the tales as superstition often found themselves facing inexplicable misfortune, crops failing without reason, wells drying overnight, or their homes invaded by flocks of birds that tore at curtains, shingles, and even the flesh of animals. Fear became a constant undercurrent, threading through every conversation, every meal, every journey beyond the village boundary. The nights were the worst. Darkness seemed heavier, almost tangible, pressing down upon the village with a weight that could be felt in the bones. The crows roosted in greater numbers, filling the trees and rooftops with their eerie, watchful presence. Their calls were no longer mere sounds of nature, but orchestrated signals, warning or guiding, the meaning only known to the girl who fed them. Some villagers reported seeing shadows moving against the moonlight, figures darting through the streets that could not be human. Children refused to leave their homes after dusk, and even adults hesitated to tend to chores in the fading light. A sense of inevitability hung in the air, as though something monumental and terrible was gathering strength just beyond the village boundary, drawn toward them by the girl's rituals and the ever-watchful crows. The girl herself did little to hide her growing dominance over the environment. She was frequently seen in the central square, scattering seeds and small scraps of meat while flocks of crows circled above, forming intricate patterns that seemed to communicate threats or promises. Villagers who approached her too closely reported sudden chills, a feeling of being watched not only by the girl, but by the birds themselves, as though the crows shared her consciousness and could judge the hearts of all who dared enter their presence. Farmers found their tools missing, their barns damaged and their fields ravaged, yet no one could claim direct blame for these occurrences. The invisible power she wielded through the birds became a silent terror, and slowly people began to accept that the natural order of their lives had been altered irreversibly by her mere existence. Even the most devout of the villagers began to lose faith in prayer as protection. The local preacher attempted to intervene, offering blessings, prayers, and sermons, warning that the girl's gifts were demonic in nature. Yet his words seemed impotent. The crows ignored his voice, and he returned home humiliated after witnessing flocks descend in response to her presence alone. Villagers noted that accidents and mysterious illnesses were more frequent around the girl, often striking those who had confronted her with words or actions. Fear became as practical as it was spiritual, a guiding principle for behavior, and the girl thrived in the tension, her power quietly consolidating as the village itself seemed to fray at the edges. Reports began to circulate of even stranger phenomena. Doors would open and close on their own, windows shattered without cause, and the sound of cawing would echo from the forest even on windless days. Those who tried to intervene directly, approaching the girl to demand explanations or attempt to stop her rituals, found themselves paralyzed with dread, often retreating in silence. The girl's influence extended beyond the immediate village, as travelers passing through would speak of unsettling encounters. Black-winged birds gathering unnaturally in clusters, shadows moving with uncanny precision, and the faint, lingering impression that some force was watching, calculating, and waiting. The village itself transformed under the shadow of the girl and her avian allies. Once bustling with ordinary routines, it now exuded an oppressive atmosphere, as though life itself had been drained from the streets and buildings. Those who once laughed and labored together now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the sky and to the edges of the forest. Children learned quickly to obey warnings, keeping their distance from the girl, while adults avoided paths she frequented. Even the natural rhythm of the seasons seemed altered, with crops failing unpredictably and storms arriving without warning. The crows, ever present, became the unmistakable harbingers of doom, their black silhouettes filling the horizon and reminding the villagers of the growing influence of the girl who fed them. As the girl matured, her interactions with the crows evolved from simple feeding to something far more sinister and deliberate. The villagers began noticing patterns that suggested her relationship with the birds was not mere companionship, but a dark and deliberate orchestration of events. In the dead of night, she would disappear into the forest, returning at dawn with her clothes torn and stained, hands darkened with soil, and a calm expression that unsettled anyone who saw her. Rumors swirled that she performed rituals deep in the woods, rites that no one could witness fully and live to tell the tale. Small artifacts were left behind, animal bones arranged in symbols, feathers scattered in geometric patterns, and occasionally remnants of things that once had life, human or otherwise, their origins whispered but never confirmed. Villagers spoke of a quiet reverence she seemed to command from the crows, the birds acting almost like her ministers, executing tasks with intelligence that exceeded natural instincts. Her rituals were subtle at first, hidden behind layers of normalcy, but their effects were impossible to ignore. Livestock would fall ill without explanation, crops wilted in patches, and a general sense of malaise spread among the people. Those who attempted to interfere with her actions found themselves facing inexplicable misfortune. Tools would vanish, injuries would occur in the most mundane ways, and an oppressive presence would follow them like a shadow. Children would wake from nightmares claiming the girl's voice had called to them through the wind, accompanied by the cawing of crows that circled their homes. Even those who doubted the supernatural could not deny the growing influence she held over her surroundings, a force that seemed to bend nature itself to her will. The girl's presence became more commanding as the rituals grew in complexity. Villagers reported that she would stand in the center of open fields, crows forming thick clouds above her head, and chant words no one recognized. The birds reacted instantly, descending upon the land in precise formations, and when she waved her hands, they scattered in patterns that seemed to communicate messages or warnings. Livestock would panic, doors would slam, and a cold wind would whip through the village even in the stillest of nights. Those who dared to watch from a distance swore that her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, reflecting the moon in a way that suggested she drew power from forces beyond human comprehension. People whispered that she had become a conduit, her connection to the crows not merely physical but spiritual, a link to some dark intelligence that observed, judged, and punished according to unknown laws. As time went on, the girl's rituals escalated, no longer confined to feeding the birds or simple commands. She began to draw the villagers' attention through subtle manipulations, arranging objects in the streets and at their homes in ways that implied ominous meaning. Skulls of small animals appeared on doorsteps, feathers were scattered in spirals, and scratches etched into wooden beams resembled strange symbols. Some of the more fearful villagers claimed that the crows themselves seemed to follow instructions, their black eyes fixed on certain houses or people, pecking and clawing with precision as though carrying out instructions whispered by their mistress. Livestock would vanish completely from their pens, only to be found days later partially dismembered in the fields, a grisly sign that her influence reached far beyond her immediate presence. The girl's reputation grew alongside the horror. Even adults who had previously dismissed her as a strange but harmless child began to speak in fearful tones. They would tell one another of the cold, empty gaze she maintained while performing her rituals, of how the crows obeyed her without question, and of the eerie stillness that descended on the land when she was near. The preacher, once confident in his moral authority, found himself silenced, unable to curb her growing dominance. Prayers and sermons had no effect. The ritual seemed impervious to human intervention, and even the bravest villagers hesitated to confront her. Fear became instinctual, a survival mechanism, as the girl's powers manifested in ways that were increasingly terrifying and inescapable. Some villagers attempted to investigate, following her into the woods to uncover the nature of her rites, but few returned with coherent stories. Those who did speak were pale, trembling, and spoke only of the movements of the crows, the eerie patterns, and the overwhelming feeling that something beyond comprehension was observing them. Some claimed to have seen small human bones incorporated into her rituals, arranged with meticulous care among the feathers and talismans she left behind. Others insisted that she spoke in tongues that made the hair on their necks stand, words that called the living to their deaths and commanded the loyalty of the dead through the birds. The forest itself seemed alive around her, responding to her presence, whispering with the voices of the crows and warning of the power she wielded. The girl's control over life and death became undeniable. Animals and plants seemed to obey her whims, the crows serving as enforcers, messengers, and observers. Illness struck suddenly in homes she passed, and those who refused to acknowledge her rituals found themselves haunted in ways both physical and psychological. Night after night, villagers would hear cawing echoing through the streets, shadows flitting across walls, and a sense that the girl and her army of birds were judging every action, every thought. People began to whisper that her power was beyond the natural world, a dark intelligence harnessed through relentless devotion to the crows and their unholy obedience. Even the oldest, most stoic villagers began to fear her, realizing that she had transcended mere childhood and entered a realm where few dared to tread, commanding death and life through the wings of her ever-watchful servants. The day of horror arrived quietly, with no warning beyond the restless behavior of the crows and the growing unease that had settled over the village like a suffocating fog. Villagers woke to an unnatural stillness that pressed against their homes and hearts, a silence that felt wrong in every way. The crows, which had long been drawn to the girl, gathered in unprecedented numbers, filling the skies with black wings that blotched out the morning sun. Their cries were harsh, piercing, and almost human in their cadence, a chorus of menace that seemed to carry a warning of what was to come. Doors that had been carefully bolted against intrusion rattled and shook, windows shuddered, and even the bravest villagers hesitated to step outside, sensing that something beyond mortal comprehension was about to unfold. The girl, calm and resolute as ever, walked through the streets with the crows circling her like an ominous halo, and those who glimpsed her expression noted a serenity that contrasted sharply with the panic spreading among the townspeople. No one could explain the sequence of events that followed, for they occurred too quickly and with a precision that defied understanding. Animals ran screaming from their pens, tearing through fences and trampling crops in their frenzy, driven by a force that no one could resist or comprehend. Villagers tried to gather their families, shouting warnings and calling for neighbors, but the sheer number of crows descending upon the village created chaos that made organized action impossible. The air was thick with the flapping of wings and the scent of decay, a combination so overwhelming that it caused some to flee blindly into the forest, where the darkness seemed to swallow them without mercy. The girl moved among the panic with deliberate calm, scattering small scraps of food and muttering words in her eerie, unrecognizable tongue, and the crows responded instantly, a vast, coordinated swarm that followed her commands as though the entire village were part of some grim ceremony orchestrated by her hand. When the first screams rang out, those who survived to witness them claimed that the crows attacked with methodical intelligence. They tore through fences, pecked with unnerving precision, and even carried away those who had fallen. Villagers fought back with whatever they could, sticks, stones, knives, but their efforts were futile. The birds seemed impervious to human resistance, guided by an unseen force that amplified their natural instincts into something grotesquely intelligent. The girl remained at the center of the storm, her hands raised, chanting softly as if conducting the chaos that enveloped the village. The sky darkened with the swirling mass of wings, casting shadows that twisted across buildings and streets, turning familiar homes into a nightmarish landscape where terror reigned supreme. By midday, the village was unrecognizable. Homes had been stripped of doors and windows, livestock lay mutilated, and the air was thick with the cries of those who had been caught or trapped by the relentless swarm. The girl moved silently through the carnage, her presence almost spectral amidst the destruction. She left behind only small markers of her passage, arranged bones, feathers laid in intricate patterns, and traces of blood that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the crow's cries. Some who survived in hiding later reported that they could see her standing atop the central hill, the birds forming a spinning vortex above her head, chanting in unison with her voice as though the entire flock had become extensions of her will. It was not merely an attack, it was a calculated, deliberate obliteration of the village, a transformation of the familiar into the unrecognizable through the terrifying agency of a single girl and her legion of birds. Those who were fortunate enough to escape into the surrounding forest returned later to find no trace of the village's population. The homes were left eerily intact in structure but stripped of life. Doors swung on broken hinges, windows were shattered, and inside there was only silence punctuated by the occasional caw echoing through the empty streets. The ground was littered with feathers, and in some areas the bones of villagers were scattered, picked clean by the crows. The scale of the devastation defied belief, and the few survivors who dared speak of it described scenes so horrifying that their words were dismissed as the ramblings of traumatized minds. But the evidence remained undeniable. An entire village had been reduced to a grotesque tableau of death and ruin, orchestrated with terrifying intelligence by the girl and her avian army. The forest surrounding the village became a sanctuary for those who had managed to flee, though even there, the pervasive influence of the girl and the crows was felt. Travelers who passed through later described seeing flocks of birds circling the empty village from a distance, a warning that it was no longer safe to enter, and hearing the faint melodic chanting of the girl carried by the wind. Some claimed they glimpsed her moving among the treetops, feeding the crows as if preparing for another ritual, her presence more spectral than ever. The crows themselves seemed to have grown larger, more aggressive and unnaturally intelligent, leaving witnesses with the distinct impression that the girl had bound them to her will in a manner that transcended ordinary understanding. Legends quickly grew around the events. Stories told by survivors and travelers alike spoke of the girl as both witch and goddess, a figure whose power was absolute and whose connection to the crows allowed her to dominate life and death. Scholars and curious outsiders arrived to study the remains, but many left with a sense of foreboding that kept them from returning. Some claiming to hear whispers and see shadows that hinted the girl's influence had not ended with the destruction. In the years that followed, no one dared to rebuild the village, leaving it to rot and be reclaimed by the forest, a grim monument to the girl who had turned an entire community into a field of bones and feathers, and a story that would haunt the minds of those who heard it for generations. After the village was destroyed and the gruesome aftermath settled into eerie silence, the story of the girl and the crows spread beyond the hills of Kentucky, carried by travelers, merchants, and wandering preachers who spoke of the horrors they had witnessed or heard secondhand. The village itself became a forbidden place, a land haunted not just by the memory of death, but by the living presence of the girl and the vast crows that followed her. Those who dared to pass near the ruins swore that the sky seemed unnaturally dark, as if the birds formed a permanent canopy that blotted out sunlight and cast shifting shadows across the empty streets. The air smelled faintly of decay, of feathers and blood, and a soft, almost melodic chanting was sometimes carried by the wind, chilling the spine of anyone who heard it. Travelers spoke of seeing the girl herself, moving with a ghostly grace atop the ruins, feeding her army of birds, her eyes reflecting a knowledge and power that humans could not comprehend. Stories about the girl evolved into legends over time, each retelling adding layers of fear and awe. Some claimed that she was immortal, a witch who had made a pact with death itself, and that her presence could never be truly vanquished. Others whispered that she had become a godlike figure to the crows, commanding them to do her bidding across forests, hills, and valleys far beyond the original village. The idea that a single human being could exert such dominion over creatures of nature terrified and fascinated those who heard the tales, and the ruins of the village became a place of dark pilgrimage for the curious, the brave, and the foolhardy. Many returned changed, haunted by fleeting glimpses of black wings in the corner of their vision, the sound of wings flapping in the night, and the sensation of being watched by countless eyes. Even the land surrounding the former village seemed to bear her influence. Crops refused to grow as they once had, and animals avoided the area entirely, wandering off in terror if forced near. The forest crept closer to the abandoned structures, swallowing streets and fields with alarming speed, and the crows remained constant, their numbers growing as though multiplied by some unnatural force. People who ventured too close often fell ill or experienced sudden accidents, and the villagers from nearby settlements would warn outsiders to keep their distance, insisting that the girl's gaze could reach across miles and that the birds were her eyes and ears. It became a place of dread, not just because of the remains of bones and feathers, but because the air itself seemed charged with her will, a lingering presence that could not be escaped. Over the decades, the girl's legend transformed into cautionary tales and whispered warnings. Parents would tell their children not to wander too far, speaking of the girl who commanded death in the form of black wings and feasts upon those who crossed her. Hunters reported seeing vast flocks moving unnaturally, circling over the treetops in formations that suggested intelligence and intent rather than random flight. Travelers spoke of hearing faint voices carried on the wind, voices that mimicked crying children or distressed villagers, only to vanish when approached. All agreed that the girl's connection with the crows was no ordinary bond. She had forged a symbiosis with creatures that were both living and symbolic, transforming them into instruments of fear and agents of her unknown, malevolent power. Some legends went even further, claiming that the girl could appear anywhere a flock of crows gathered, her power stretching beyond the bounds of the abandoned village. It was said that she could manipulate the flock to spy, to torment, and even to deliver death, and that the crows themselves had become extensions of her consciousness. Farmers would find their livestock mauled inexplicably. Travelers disappeared along lonely roads, and whispers suggested that the girl's will reached into the hearts and minds of those who dared challenge her authority. The concept of her power became so ingrained that entire communities adjusted their behaviors out of fear, avoiding forests and roads near the village, treating any gathering of crows as a sign of her attention, a warning, or an omen of inevitable misfortune. The girl's story endured because it touched on something primal, a fear that blended the supernatural with the natural, the human with the wild. It was the notion that one individual, through patience, cunning, and a connection to creatures often seen as harbingers of death, could command forces far beyond ordinary human influence. The ruins of the village served as a constant reminder that the line between life and death, safety and terror, was fragile, and that power could be wielded in ways that defied understanding. Tales of sightings, of strange rituals in the forest, and of crows that appeared where they should not have continued to circulate, ensuring that the memory of the girl who fed the crows was never forgotten. Even generations later, people passing near the old village ruins reported glimpses of her silhouette among the trees or the fleeting shadow of wings darkening the sky. Hunters, trappers, and wanderers would occasionally hear her chant carried on the wind, faint yet unmistakably present, and feel the weight of countless unseen eyes tracking their every movement. Children would wake screaming from nightmares filled with black feathers and sharp beaks, and adults who dismissed the stories found themselves uneasy, unable to shake the impression that she had never left. The girl's legend became inseparable from the landscape itself, a haunting presence that intertwined history, horror, and the primal fear of being powerless in the face of a single individual who commanded life and death with the aid of an unholy flock.